Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found your way in. This space is about slowing down just enough to look carefully at how the universe actually behaves, not just how we talk about it. We explore persistence, change, collapse, and renewal across physics, biology, life, and even civilization, always asking one quiet question: what survives and why? This video is part of a longer series where each pillar builds on the last. You don't need equations here. You don't need credentials. What you need is patience, because the subject of this pillar is time itself and why complexity can't exist without it. Today's pillar is called Why Complexity Requires Slowness. And to be clear right from the start, this isn't an argument for stagnation or fear of change. It's an attempt to understand something far more fundamental: why systems that change too fast often lose themselves, even when they appear powerful, efficient, or advanced. We live in a culture that equates speed with progress: faster technology, faster learning, faster response, faster growth. But when we look at nature, really look, we see a very different pattern. The most complex systems are not fast. They are slow, layered, and deeply constrained by memory. That's what this pillar is about. We tend to think that complexity comes from speed: faster computers, faster communication, faster innovation, faster change. It feels intuitive, almost obvious, that acceleration must be the engine of progress. But everywhere we look in the natural world, the opposite is true. The most complex systems we know are slow. They take time to form, time to adapt, time to repair, and time to stabilize. They don't rush toward their future. They carry their past with them, layer by layer, whether they want to or not. And when systems are forced to change too quickly, something subtle but devastating happens. They don't simply fail in a dramatic way. They lose continuity. They lose memory. They stop being the system they once were, even if they keep operating for a while. Fast systems don't fail because they are weak. They fail because they never had time to become stable. In this pillar, I want to explore a simple but uncomfortable idea. Complexity is inseparable from slowness. Not because slowness is safer or wiser or more virtuous, but because memory, real physical memory, takes time to exist. Rocks remember through layers. Ecosystems remember through species relationships. Bodies remember through tissue and immune response. Minds remember through structure and repetition. None of these things can be rushed without cost. When change happens faster than memory can form, systems don't adapt. They forget. And forgetting, at scale, looks like collapse. This isn't about nostalgia or resisting progress. It's about understanding the tempo that makes persistence possible at all. Because without time, complexity cannot accumulate. And without memory, complexity cannot survive. When most people hear the word stability, they picture something static. They picture something that doesn't move, doesn't change, doesn't drift. And because of that, stability can sound boring or even suspicious, like it's the enemy of growth. But in real systems, stability does not mean stillness. Stability means something much more specific. It means a system can change and still remain itself. That is the first idea we need to hold on to. A stable system is not a system that never changes. A stable system is a system that can absorb change without losing its identity. Now, here's where the problem begins. A system doesn't lose its identity because one disturbance happens. It loses its identity when disturbances arrive faster than the system can repair, recover, or rebalance. In other words, stability is not only about what happens. Stability is about how fast it happens and how fast the system can respond. So today we're going to talk about rate, not as a math concept, not as an equation, but as a real-world force that decides what survives and what collapses. There's a simple relationship that shows up everywhere: from physics to biology to civilization. And it's this: if damage accumulates faster than repair, collapse is not a possibility. Collapse is a certainty. The only question is how long it takes. And a lot of the time, collapse doesn't look like a dramatic explosion. It looks like drift. It looks like gradual loss of coordination. It looks like the system still running, still moving, still producing outputs, but no longer maintaining the core structures that made it what it was. This is why fast systems are dangerous. Not because fast is inherently bad, but because speed compresses the time available for repair. It compresses the time available for learning. It compresses the time available for feedback to correct mistakes. When a system has no time to correct itself, it becomes fragile, even if it appears strong. It becomes brittle, even if it appears efficient. It becomes unstable, even if it looks like it's thriving. So let's make that concrete. Imagine something simple. Imagine a bridge. A bridge can handle cars driving across it all day. The load comes, the load goes, and the structure returns to baseline. That's stability. It's not that the bridge doesn't change. It flexes, it vibrates, it responds, but it returns. That return is the point. Now imagine the same bridge, but every few seconds there's a heavier and heavier load, and the bridge never gets a moment to settle. The vibrations stack, the stress accumulates, the small cracks don't get repaired, the metal doesn't cool back down. In the beginning it still looks fine, because the failure isn't visible yet, but the rate mismatch is already there, and eventually the structure reaches a point where it cannot return. That's not just a bridge story, that is a universal story. In ecosystems, the same thing happens. If a forest experiences a fire, it can recover. If it experiences a drought, it can recover. If it experiences a pest outbreak, it can recover. But if the disturbances stack faster than the regeneration cycle, the system doesn't get to return. The recovery phase gets interrupted over and over, and eventually the system crosses into a new regime, not because it chose to adapt, but because it was never given the time required to remain what it was. In biology, it's the same. Your body can handle stress, it can handle injury, it can handle infection. But if those demands come faster than repair, you don't just get tired, you lose function. And what people call burnout is often exactly this: a rate mismatch between demand and repair, not a moral failure, not a weakness, a tempo failure. Now let's slow down and isolate the key point. Rate mismatch doesn't announce itself. It hides inside normal operation. The system still looks like it's working. The outputs still happen. The routines still run. But the internal margins are being eaten away. This is why people miss it. Humans tend to look for thresholds. We look for the moment things break. But in most complex systems, the break happens long after the stability has already been lost. The failure is delayed. The failure is deferred. The failure shows up when the system can no longer pretend it is still closing its budgets. And here's the most important part. What determines whether a system is stable is not its best day. It's whether it can return after disruption. A system that never needs to recover has not been tested. A system that recovers slowly may still be stable if disturbances are slow enough. But a system that recovers slowly in a fast world is already in danger. So stability is inseparable from tempo. That's the core claim. Now let's talk about why this connects directly to complexity. Complexity requires coordination. Complexity requires multiple parts to interact in a structured way. Complexity requires relationships that remain consistent long enough to become dependable, and coordination takes time. It requires signals to propagate, feedback to settle, and errors to be corrected. When the environment changes too fast, coordination becomes impossible. The relationships that once held the system together can't stabilize. The system can still exist physically, but its complexity collapses because the coordination layer breaks first. This is why a fast-changing environment selects against complexity. Not because complexity is bad, but because complexity is slow to build and slow to repair. Complexity requires time to remember its own organization. Now, there is an important trap here. People hear this and assume it means complexity is fragile. But that's not the right framing. Complexity is not fragile. Complexity is expensive. And one of the costs is time. A complex system has more ways to fail, but it also has more ways to recover. The problem is that recovery is not instantaneous. Recovery is a process, and recovery only works if the system is given enough time to complete it. So the real question becomes, what is the system's recovery time compared to the disturbance cadence? You don't need math to understand this. Think about learning a skill. If you practice something and then immediately change the rules before your brain has consolidated the learning, you don't get mastery, you get confusion. If you keep changing the inputs faster than the brain can encode patterns, you don't get intelligence, you get noise. That is a micro version of the same principle. In a society, if laws change faster than institutions can adapt, enforcement becomes chaotic. If values change faster than communities can integrate them, coherence breaks. If technology changes faster than governance can respond, the system begins to drift into instability. Not because anyone change is bad, but because the rate overwhelms the stabilizers. And here is where the phrase from this pillar really becomes sharp. Fast systems forget themselves. They don't have time to carry their own structure forward. They become reactive. They become patchwork. They become a series of emergency responses rather than a coherent organism. So if you want a simple rule to carry forward from this section, it is this. Stability is not a property of a system alone. It is a property of a system in relation to the tempo of its world. A system that is stable in a slow world can fail in a fast world without changing its internal design at all. The environment can simply outrun it. Now I want to add one more layer, because this is where people misinterpret the argument. They will say, so are you saying we should slow everything down? And the answer is not that simple. What I am saying is that the universe does not allow complexity to outrun its own stabilization time. You can push speed, you can push growth, you can push change. But if you do that without expanding the system's repair capacity, memory capacity, and feedback capacity, then the speed becomes self-defeating. In other words, slowness is not the goal. Slowness is the condition that allows complexity to become real. And that leads us into the next section, because once you see that stability is tempo-limited, you realize something else. Stability is not just about rate, it is about what survives the rate. And what survives the rate is memory. So next, we're going to make a claim that sounds philosophical at first, but is actually physical. Memory is not a metaphor. Memory is a property of systems that persist long enough to carry structure forward in time. And once you understand that, the rest of this pillar starts to click into place. When we talk about memory, most people immediately think about minds, brains, thoughts, experiences, maybe written records or digital storage. Memory feels psychological, informational, or abstract. But that intuition turns out to be deeply misleading. Memory did not begin with minds, and it does not depend on awareness. Memory is far older than thought. Memory is a physical property. To say that clearly and carefully, memory is the persistence of structure across time, such that past states continue to influence future behavior. That's it. No awareness required, no intention, no meaning. Just structure that survives long enough to matter. Once you see memory this way, you start noticing it everywhere. A rock face remembers the forces that shaped it. Each layer is a record of pressure, temperature, sediment, and time. The rock doesn't think, but it carries its history forward. That history constrains how it breaks, how it erodes, and how it interacts with its environment. Ice cores remember atmospheric composition. Tree rings remember droughts and growth years. River channels remember flood regimes. Crystals remember how they formed. Magnetic domains remember past fields. None of these systems are conscious, but all of them encode information about their past in their present structure. This is the kind of memory we're talking about here. And once we accept that memory is physical, something important happens. Memory stops being a nice-to-have feature of complex systems and becomes a requirement. Without memory, complexity cannot persist, because complexity is nothing more than structured relationships that remain stable across time. Now let's slow this down even more. Complexity is not just many parts. You can have many parts moving randomly and still have no complexity. Complexity arises when relationships between parts are constrained, repeatable, and dependable. Those relationships only exist if the system can remember them. And remembering in physical systems means resisting erasure. This is where entropy enters the picture, not as an enemy, but as a cost. Entropy is the tendency for differences to blur, for structure to decay, for information to be lost. Memory exists only where entropy is resisted locally, long enough for structure to be maintained. That resistance is never free. Every memory has a cost. It costs energy, material, time, or all three. A system must continually pay that cost, or memory fades. When memory fades, coordination fades. When coordination fades, complexity collapses. This is why memory and slowness are inseparable. Memory cannot be written instantaneously. It must be encoded, reinforced, and stabilized. That process takes time. If the environment changes before the encoding completes, the memory never becomes real. The system moves on without carrying its past forward. Think about learning again, but now from a physical perspective. When you learn a new skill, your brain does not just flip a switch. Synaptic connections strengthen gradually. Pathways are reinforced through repetition. Sleep consolidates learning. If you interrupt that process repeatedly, learning fails. Not because the brain is incapable, but because the memory never stabilized. That is not a special property of brains. It is a general property of physical memory. Now let's connect this back to Section 1. We talked about rate versus stability. What we are really talking about is the rate at which memory can be formed versus the rate at which it is erased. If erasure outpaces formation, the system becomes amnesiac. It still exists, but it no longer carries its structure forward. This is why fast systems forget themselves. They are not given time to remember. And forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting removes the constraints that kept the system coordinated. Once those constraints weaken, behavior becomes noisy, reactive, and brittle. The system starts responding only to the immediate present because the past no longer has a stable representation. This is why memory is a stabilizer. A system with memory doesn't just respond to what is happening now. It responds to what has happened before. It carries forward lessons, adaptations, and constraints that shape its future behavior. That is what allows complexity to build. Now consider what happens when memory is shallow. A shallow memory system can respond quickly. It can pivot rapidly. It can chase immediate optimization, but it cannot accumulate long-term structure. Every change wipes the slate clean. Every adaptation starts over. The system never gets to compound its learning. In contrast, a deep memory system responds more slowly, but when it adapts, it keeps the adaptation. The cost is paid once, and the benefit persists. This is one of the most important trade-offs in nature: speed versus memory depth. Fast systems optimize for the present. Slow systems optimize for continuity, and continuity is what allows complexity to grow. Now let's look at a subtle but critical distinction. Memory is not just storage, memory is constraint. When a system remembers something, it is no longer free to behave arbitrarily. Its past restricts its future. That restriction is not a flaw. It is the source of stability. This is why structure exists at all. A river remembers its banks. A body remembers its immune history. A culture remembers its norms. A language remembers its grammar. These memories limit possible behavior, but those limits are exactly what make coordinated behavior possible. Without memory, everything is possible, and when everything is possible, nothing is stable. This is where the collapse of complexity really happens, not when parts break, but when constraints dissolve. When memory erodes, the system loses the rules that kept it organized. It doesn't explode. It unravels. And again, this unraveling is often invisible at first. The system still functions, the outputs still exist, the activity continues, but internally, the stabilizing memory is thinning, the margins are shrinking, the repair cycles are incomplete, the coordination layer is fraying. By the time failure is obvious, memory was lost long ago. This is why collapse often feels sudden, even though it was inevitable. The system crossed the memory threshold quietly, and only later crossed the performance threshold. Now let's bring this back to the central claim of this pillar. Complexity requires slowness, because memory requires time. Not because slowness is inherently good, not because speed is inherently bad, but because the universe does not allow memory to form instantaneously. There is always a minimum time required to encode structure, reinforce it, and protect it against entropy. When we force systems to change faster than that time allows, we are not asking them to adapt. We are asking them to forget. And forgetting is not adaptation. This applies at every scale. In material science, rapid thermal cycling weakens structure. In biology, rapid environmental change overwhelms adaptation. In cognition, overload degrades learning. In societies, rapid institutional change erodes legitimacy and coordination. In technology, rapid iteration without consolidation creates brittle systems that fail in unexpected ways. The pattern is the same everywhere. Memory must be allowed to form. And that brings us to the next section, because once we understand memory as physical and costly, another question emerges naturally. If memory is required for complexity, and memory takes time, then what exactly happens when systems are pushed to operate faster than memory can stabilize? Why do fast systems not just struggle, but actively erase their own past? That's what we'll explore next, when we look at why fast systems forget themselves, and why forgetting is often mistaken for flexibility. Section 2, Why Fast Systems Forget Themselves. Now that we've grounded memory as a physical property, we can say something that might feel counterintuitive at first, but becomes unavoidable once you see it clearly. Speed does not just limit memory, speed actively erases it. This is the part people often miss. They assume fast systems merely lack depth, or lack refinement, or lack patience. But the deeper problem is not absence. The deeper problem is interference. Fast change doesn't simply fail to write memory. It overwrites memory before it can stabilize. To understand this, we need to think about how memory actually forms in physical systems. Memory formation is not a single event. It is a process. First, a structure is perturbed. Then the system responds. Then that response must be reinforced repeatedly under similar conditions. Finally, the structure must survive long enough to become part of the system's baseline behavior. Every step in that chain takes time. If a new perturbation arrives before the previous one has been integrated, the system is forced to respond again, but now without having learned from the last event. The system remains reactive rather than adaptive. It is always responding to the present, never consolidating the past. This is what forgetting looks like in physical terms. And importantly, forgetting does not require decay. Forgetting can happen even when the system is energetic, active, and productive. Forgetting happens when change outpaces consolidation. This is why fast systems can look powerful right up until they collapse. They are busy, they are responsive, they are adaptive in the short term, but they are not accumulating stable structure. They are cycling through states without retaining them. Think about a computer system that updates constantly without allowing time for testing, integration, or stabilization. Each update is meant to improve performance, but the rapid succession creates fragility. Bugs accumulate faster than they are resolved. Dependencies break. Documentation falls behind. The system still runs, but it becomes opaque and brittle. This is not a software problem. This is a tempo problem. Now zoom out. In ecosystems, rapid environmental change prevents species from stabilizing adaptations. Traits that would be advantageous over longer timescales never have time to establish. Population structures fragment. Interdependencies dissolve. The system does not gradually adapt into a new stable form. It oscillates, degrades, or flips regimes. In human learning, the same pattern appears. When inputs change too quickly, the brain cannot form durable representations. Attention fragments. Skills fail to consolidate. Knowledge remains shallow. The system is stimulated but not educated. And again, this is not about intelligence or effort. It is about time. Now let's make an important distinction, because this is where speed is often defended incorrectly. People will say, but fast systems are flexible. They can pivot. They can respond to new conditions. And that's true, but only in a very narrow sense. Fast systems are flexible in the moment, but they are rigid across time. Why? Because without memory, flexibility has no direction. Each response is isolated. There is no accumulation of constraint. The system does not learn what not to do. It does not narrow its behavior space. It keeps trying everything over and over again. This is the illusion of adaptability. True adaptation reduces degrees of freedom. It channels behavior into stable pathways. That channeling only happens when memory persists. So fast systems are not adaptive in the deep sense. They are exploratory without convergence. They are reactive without retention. This is why they forget themselves. Now consider what happens internally when a system forgets. The system loses its internal reference points. Feedback loops no longer close cleanly. Signals arrive too late or too early. Control mechanisms overshoot or lag. Corrections amplify rather than stabilize. This is where instability becomes self-reinforcing. The faster the system moves, the less accurate its feedback becomes. The less accurate the feedback, the more aggressively it must respond to compensate. The more aggressively it responds, the faster it moves. This loop accelerates forgetting. At this point, the system may still appear highly functional. It may even outperform slower systems in short-term metrics, but internally, it is burning through its accumulated structure. This is why collapse often follows periods of apparent success. The system has already consumed its memory capital. It is running on momentum, and when that momentum runs out, there is nothing underneath it. Now let's pause here because this idea applies everywhere and it's easy to miss how universal it is. In physics, rapid forcing can drive systems out of equilibrium faster than they can relax. In chemistry, fast reactions can bypass stable intermediates. In biology, rapid stress selects for short-term survival at the expense of long-term viability. In societies, rapid reform can dissolve institutions faster than replacements can stabilize. The pattern is the same. Fast change compresses the time available for error correction. Error correction is where memory lives. Without error correction, systems do not just fail, they misidentify success. They confuse activity with progress. They mistake motion for stability. This is why speed is seductive. It produces immediate feedback. It produces visible results. It feels like control, but that feeling can be profoundly misleading. Now, we need to say something precise here because otherwise this becomes a caricature. Slowness does not guarantee memory. A system can be slow and still forgetful if it lacks reinforcement. Slowness is necessary, but not sufficient. Memory also requires repetition, protection, and constraint. But speed almost guarantees forgetting unless the system has extraordinary buffering and repair capacity, and most complex systems do not. This is why the most enduring structures in the universe are slow. Geological processes, evolution, cultural norms, long-lived institutions. These systems move at tempos that allow memory to accumulate and stabilize. And when they are forced to accelerate beyond that tempo, they don't smoothly adapt. They shed complexity. They simplify. They revert to more primitive organizational forms, not because those forms are better, but because they are easier to maintain under speed. This is the hidden cost of acceleration. Complexity collapses before mass does. Coordination collapses before components fail. And this is why forgetting is so dangerous. A system that forgets does not know what it has lost. It cannot rebuild what it no longer remembers. It cannot return to a previous stable state because the constraints that define that state are gone. At that point, recovery becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible. This brings us to the next critical step in the argument. If fast systems forget themselves and forgetting erodes complexity, then we need to understand what role entropy plays in this process, not as an abstract law, but as a practical force that governs how memory is paid for, maintained, or lost. Because forgetting is not free, it is entropy winning faster than structure can resist. That is where we're going next. In the next section, we'll look at entropy, learning, and the real price of structure, and why complexity survives only when entropy is paid slowly, deliberately, and continuously. Section 3. Entropy, learning, and the price of structure. At this point, we need to talk about entropy, not as a formula, not as a symbol, and not as an abstract law that lives in textbooks, but as something that actively shapes which structures can exist and which ones cannot. Entropy is often described as disorder, but that description is misleading. Entropy is not chaos. Entropy is the tendency for differences to disappear unless work is done to preserve them. It is the natural pressure toward sameness, smoothing, and loss of structure, and memory exists only where entropy is resisted. This is the part that matters most. Every time a system remembers something, it is holding a difference in place. It is maintaining a pattern that would otherwise dissolve. That maintenance has a cost, and that cost is paid continuously, not just once. There is no such thing as permanent structure without ongoing entropy payment. Once you accept that, learning starts to look very different. Learning is not accumulation. Learning is not storage. Learning is not copying information into a system. Learning is the slow process of reshaping a system so that certain responses become easier and others become harder. That reshaping requires energy, material, and time. and it must be maintained against entropy. This is why learning cannot be rushed. If you try to learn too quickly, the system may appear to absorb information, but it has not reorganized itself. The information remains superficial. It has not become structural. It has not altered the underlying constraints that guide behavior. And if the learning is not structural, entropy erases it as soon as attention shifts. This applies to brains, bodies, ecosystems, institutions, and technologies. Everywhere learning happens, entropy pushes back. Now let's be precise, because entropy is often misunderstood as an enemy. Entropy is not malicious. It is not destructive by intent. Entropy is simply the background condition of the universe. It is the reason effort matters at all. Without entropy, structure would be trivial. Everything would persist automatically. Memory would be free. Complexity would require no maintenance. But that is not the universe we live in. We live in a universe where structure exists only because something is continuously working to hold it together. That work is slow. This is why complexity does not appear suddenly. It accumulates gradually through repeated cycles of reinforcement. Each cycle pays a small entropy cost. Over time, those payments build something durable. Now contrast that with systems that attempt to shortcut this process. A shortcut tries to achieve structure without paying the full entropy cost. It relies on temporary order, external enforcement, or narrow conditions that mask instability. These systems often look impressive at first. They appear efficient. They appear optimized. They appear modern. But what they lack is depth. Depth comes from time spent resisting entropy. You cannot simulate that time. You cannot compress it arbitrarily. You can only pay it. This is why systems that try to grow complexity faster than they can pay entropy eventually collapse, not because they were wrong to grow, but because they were wrong about the cost. And here's where learning and entropy intersect in a critical way. Learning is a form of entropy management. When a system learns, it reorganizes itself to make certain behaviors cheaper and others more expensive. That reorganization must be stable enough to survive noise, disturbance, and time. If learning happens too quickly, the system may change behavior without changing structure. That is adaptation in appearance only. Entropy then erases the change as soon as pressure is removed. This is why repetition matters. This is why practice matters. This is why institutions require norms, not just rules. This is why cultures take generations to stabilize. This is why evolution operates over deep time. Each repetition reinforces structure. Each reinforcement makes the memory harder to erase. Over time, the system develops inertia, not stagnation, but persistence. Now let's connect this back to the core claim of this pillar. Complexity requires slowness because entropy must be paid gradually. If entropy is paid too quickly, the system overheats. If entropy is deferred, the system accumulates hidden debt. If entropy is ignored, the system collapses suddenly when the bill comes due. There is no version of complexity that escapes this. This is why fast systems often appear to learn rapidly, but then fail catastrophically. They have not paid the entropy cost required to stabilize their structure. They are running on borrowed order, and borrowed order always expires. Now think about this in social systems. Institutions that change rules rapidly without allowing norms to stabilize may look responsive, but they lose legitimacy. Technologies that update constantly without consolidation may look innovative, but they become brittle. Educational systems that rush content without consolidation may produce exposure, but not understanding. In every case, entropy wins when stabilization time is ignored. And here's a subtle but crucial point. Paying entropy slowly does not mean avoiding change. It means matching the pace of change to the system's ability to integrate it. Slow learning is not inefficient learning, it is durable learning. Fast learning is not advanced learning, it is fragile learning. Once you see this, you start to notice how often collapse is blamed on the wrong thing. People blame corruption or incompetence or lack of resources. But underneath those narratives, the real issue is often tempo mismatch. The system was forced to change faster than it could reorganize itself. The entropy bill was coming due, and no one was paying it. Now let's bring this full circle. Memory resists entropy. Learning builds memory. Complexity depends on learning, and learning requires time. Remove time, and the entire chain breaks. This is why complexity collapses when change is too fast. Not because complexity is weak, but because it is honest about its costs. And that honesty matters, because it leads us directly into the next section. If entropy must be paid slowly, and if tempo selects what can persist, then slowness itself becomes a filter, a selection mechanism that decides which systems survive and which ones cannot. That's where we're going next. In the next section, we'll look at tempo as a selection filter and why the universe doesn't just favor what is strong or efficient, but what can survive its own rate of change. Section 5, Tempo as a Selection Filter. Up to now, we've been building toward an idea that often goes unspoken, even though it operates everywhere. We've talked about rate and stability. We've talked about memory as a physical property. We've talked about entropy as a cost that must be paid slowly. When you put those together, a deeper pattern emerges. The universe does not just select for strength. It does not just select for efficiency. It does not even select for intelligence. It selects for tempo compatibility. This means that systems survive not because they are the best in some abstract sense, but because their internal pace matches the pace of the world they live in. When those tempos align, complexity can accumulate. When they do not, complexity is filtered out. This idea shows up at every scale, but it's easy to miss because we're used to thinking about selection in terms of competition. Who is stronger? Who is faster? Who is more efficient? But tempo is not about winning races. Tempo is about staying coherent long enough for memory to matter. A system that moves too slowly for its environment will be overwhelmed. A system that moves too quickly will erase itself. Survival happens in the narrow space where change is fast enough to respond, but slow enough to remember. That narrow space is where complexity lives. Now let's make this concrete. In biology, organisms are not selected simply for size, speed, or power. They are selected for life history timing, growth rate, reproduction timing, repair capacity, longevity. These are tempo traits. They determine how an organism matches the rhythms of its environment. A species that grows too slowly may never reproduce before conditions change. A species that grows too quickly may exhaust resources or accumulate errors. The species that persist are those whose internal clocks align with the cycles of their world. The same pattern appears in ecosystems. Forests that regenerate slowly can persist for centuries in stable climates, but collapse rapidly under frequent disturbance. Grasslands recover quickly, but do not support the same depth of structure. Neither is better in the abstract. Each is matched to a different disturbance tempo. Tempo selects structure. Now notice something important here. Selection by tempo is not moral. It is not intentional. It is not optimizing for beauty or meaning. It is simply filtering out systems that cannot close their budgets fast enough or slow enough relative to what the environment demands. This is why rapid environmental change is so dangerous for complex systems. It does not just challenge them, it changes the selection filter itself. When the environment accelerates, the filter narrows. Only systems with shallow memory and fast response survive. Deep layered systems are lost first. Complexity collapses not because it is flawed, but because it is slow. This is why rapid change often leads to simplification. In ecosystems, complexity gives way to opportunistic species. In societies, long-standing institutions give way to short-term coordination mechanisms. In individuals, deep skill gives way to reactive coping. These are not improvements. They are survivals under speed. Now let's pause and confront a common misunderstanding. People often think selection favors innovation, but innovation only matters if it stabilizes. Novelty without consolidation is noise. The universe does not reward novelty. It rewards what persists. And persistence requires that innovations be integrated slowly enough to become memory. This is why many innovations fail, even when they are clever or efficient. They arrive faster than the system can absorb them. They disrupt existing memory without providing time for new memory to form. The result is fragmentation, not progress. This applies to technology as much as biology. Technological systems that iterate too quickly often outpace their own governance, documentation, and repair mechanisms. The result is not adaptability, but brittleness. When failures occur, they cascade because the system no longer understands itself well enough to intervene effectively. Again, this is not a problem of intelligence or intent, it is a tempo problem. Now consider civilization. Civilizations are among the most complex systems humans participate in. They rely on shared norms, institutions, languages, laws, and trust networks. All of these are forms of memory, and all of them take time to form. When civilizational change happens at a pace that allows norms to adjust, institutions to reform, and trust to rebuild, complexity can survive. When change outpaces those processes, coherence breaks, coordination fragments. The system becomes reactive. This is why periods of rapid transformation are often followed by periods of instability, not because change was wrong, but because it happened faster than memory could reorganize. Now let's sharpen the idea even further. Tempo selection does not just filter out systems. It shapes which kinds of systems can exist at all. In slow environments, deep complexity can evolve. In fast environments, only simple, fast-cycling systems persist. This is not a temporary effect. It is a structural constraint. This means that if the world accelerates permanently, certain kinds of complexity become impossible. Not temporarily difficult, impossible. That is a sobering thought, and it leads directly to the core warning of this pillar. If we force our environments to accelerate faster than our systems can stabilize, we are not just risking failure. We are narrowing the space of what can exist. We are selecting against depth. Now, one more important clarification. Slowness does not mean immobility. Tempo-compatible systems can still change rapidly when needed, but they have buffering, slack, and memory depth that allow them to absorb shocks without erasing themselves. They don't just react, they integrate. This is why resilience is not just about bouncing back. It is about bouncing back with memory intact. Without memory, there is nothing to bounce back to. So when we say tempo is a selection filter, what we mean is this. The universe filters systems based on whether they can remain themselves under the speed of change they experience. Strength, efficiency, and intelligence matter only insofar as they support that alignment. Now let's step back and look at where this leaves us. We've seen that stability is rate limited. We've seen that memory is physical. We've seen that fast systems forget. We've seen that entropy must be paid slowly. And now we see that tempo selects what persists. This sets the stage for the next critical question. What happens when change becomes too fast for any stabilizing mechanism to keep up? What does collapse actually look like when it is driven not by scarcity, but by speed? That's what we'll explore next in Section 6, When Change Becomes Too Fast. Section 6, When Change Becomes Too Fast The first thing that breaks is not the system's structure, but its coordination. The parts still exist. The components still function, but they stop working together in a coherent way. Signals arrive out of phase. Responses are mistimed. Corrections apply to conditions that no longer exist. This loss of synchronization is devastating for complex systems because complexity depends as much on timing as it does on form. A system can have all the right parts and still fail if those parts are no longer aligned in time. When coordination fails, even intact structures become ineffective. At this stage, the system does not look collapsed. It looks busy, it looks stressed, it looks like it is constantly reacting. This is why collapse is so often misdiagnosed. Observers see motion and assume vitality, but what they are actually seeing is the system compensating for the loss of memory with increased effort. When memory erodes, control expands. Control replaces memory because the system can no longer rely on past structure to guide behavior. Instead of remembering what works, it must actively manage every interaction. That management requires energy. It requires attention. It requires constant intervention. And it must happen faster and faster as coordination degrades. This is not sustainable. Now consider repair, because repair is where tempo failure becomes irreversible. Repair is not instantaneous. Repair requires detection, diagnosis, resources, and time. When disturbances arrive faster than repair cycles can complete, repair becomes backlog. Problems accumulate. Temporary fixes replace structural solutions. Deferred maintenance becomes the norm. At first, the system appears resilient because it still functions. It is drawing down slack. It is consuming stored capacity. But slack is finite. When it runs out, failures cascade. This is why collapse often appears sudden. The system did not suddenly fail. It ran out of margin. Another critical feature of tempo-driven collapse is phase lag. Every system has delays built into it. Delays in sensing the environment, delays in processing information, delays in responding, delays in learning. These delays are unavoidable. They are not design flaws. They are physical realities. When change is slow, delays are harmless. The system can still converge toward stability, but when change accelerates, delays become destabilizing. Feedback arrives too late. Corrections overshoot. Responses amplify error instead of dampening it. The system begins to oscillate. Oscillation is one of the clearest signatures of tempo failure. The system swings between extremes, overcorrecting in one direction and then another. Each swing increases stress. Each swing erodes remaining memory. The system becomes trapped in a cycle of reaction rather than adaptation. Importantly, oscillation still looks like activity. It looks like effort. It looks like engagement. But it is not learning. It is not stabilization. It is motion without convergence. Now bring this into human terms, because this is where the idea becomes painfully familiar. Burnout is not a failure of motivation. It is not a failure of character. Burnout is a tempo mismatch. Demands arrive faster than recovery. Learning is replaced by coping. Memory is replaced by reaction. The system is always responding, never consolidating. At first, performance may even improve. Stress hormones compensate. The system runs hot, but eventually the cost comes due. Repair can no longer keep up. The system loses the ability to restore itself. Collapse becomes visible only at the end. The same pattern appears in organizations. Constant restructuring, constant policy changes, constant urgency. Institutional memory erodes. Everyone is busy. Nothing is stable. The organization becomes reactive rather than adaptive. Again, this is not about intent. It is about speed. When change is too fast, systems simplify. They shed complexity because complexity is expensive to maintain under tempo stress. Nuance disappears, redundancy is cut, long-term planning is abandoned. The system narrows its behavior space to survive. This simplification is not improvement, it is survival under constraint. And this is where one of the most dangerous misunderstandings arises. People often interpret simplification as clarity. They mistake reduced complexity for increased efficiency. But what is actually happening is that the system is abandoning depth because it can no longer afford it. When memory fails, control replaces it. And when control replaces memory, flexibility disappears. This is why systems under tempo stress often become rigid. They enforce rules more aggressively. They centralize decision-making. They suppress variation. These are not ideological choices. They are structural responses to memory loss. Control is faster than memory, but it is also more fragile. Once control fails, there is nothing underneath it. So when change becomes too fast, collapse is not a dramatic explosion. It is a quiet erosion of memory, followed by frantic compensation, followed by sudden failure when the last buffers are gone. This is why collapse feels sudden but is never surprising in hindsight. The warning signs were always there: increased effort, increased control, increased urgency, decreased learning, decreased repair, decreased margin. The system was telling the truth the entire time, and this brings us to the next and final conceptual turn of this pillar. If slowness is required for memory and speed erases it, then slowness itself has been deeply misunderstood. Slowness is not resistance to change. It is how change becomes real instead of destructive. That is where we're going next. In the next section, we'll talk about why slowness is not conservatism, not stagnation, and not fear. We'll talk about why slowness is the condition that allows transformation to occur without collapse. Section 7. Slowness is not conservatism. At this point, it's important to address a misunderstanding that almost always arises when we talk about slowness. People hear the word and immediately associate it with resistance. Resistance to progress, resistance to innovation, resistance to change itself. Slowness gets framed as fear, nostalgia, or unwillingness to move forward. That interpretation is wrong. Slowness is not opposition to change. Slowness is what allows change to become integrated rather than destructive. A system that refuses to change is brittle. It shatters when pressure finally arrives. That kind of rigidity is not what we are talking about here. What we are talking about is a system that changes at a pace that allows memory, repair, and coordination to keep up. Slowness is not stagnation. Slowness is synchronization. When a system changes slowly enough, it gives its internal structures time to reorganize. Feedback loops settle. Errors are corrected. Learning stabilizes. The system does not just move into a new state. It becomes that state. This distinction matters. Fast change moves a system from one configuration to another without allowing the system to internalize the transition. Slow change allows the transition itself to become part of the system's memory. That memory then constrains future behavior in a way that preserves coherence. This is why slowness supports transformation rather than preventing it. Consider biological development. An organism that develops too quickly does not become more advanced. It becomes malformed. Growth must be paced so that structure, function, and regulation align. Development is not a race. It is a choreography. The same is true in learning. Deep learning does not happen in bursts. It happens through repetition, reflection, and consolidation. Skills that form too quickly are unstable. Knowledge that is acquired without integration fades. Slowness is what turns exposure into understanding. Now consider social systems. Reform that unfolds slowly is often criticized as weak or indecisive. But slow reform allows norms to adjust, institutions to recalibrate, and trust to be rebuilt. It allows change to become legitimate. Rapid reform may feel decisive, but it often outpaces the system's ability to absorb it, leading to backlash, fragmentation, or collapse. Again, this is not a moral argument. It is a structural one. Slowness protects continuity while allowing change. This is why slowness should not be confused with conservatism. Conservatism seeks to preserve specific outcomes. Slowness seeks to preserve coherence. Those are very different goals. A slow system can still transform radically over time. Evolution is slow, but it has produced extraordinary novelty. Cultures evolve slowly, but they change profoundly across generations. Geological processes are slow, but they reshape entire continents. Slowness does not limit the magnitude of change. It limits the rate at which change accumulates. This is a critical distinction. Fast systems often produce dramatic shifts that cannot be sustained. Slow systems produce transformations that endure. The difference is not ambition. It is integration. Now let's address another misunderstanding. People often think slowness is inefficient. They assume that faster is always better because it produces results sooner. But efficiency without stability is illusory. A system that moves quickly but must constantly correct itself is not efficient. It is burning energy to compensate for instability. Slowness can be more efficient over time because it reduces rework, collapse, and loss. It allows learning to compound. It allows memory to persist. It allows complexity to deepen rather than reset. This is why the universe does not reward haste. The universe rewards what persists, and persistence requires that change be slow enough to be remembered. Now let's connect this back to the central theme of this pillar. Complexity requires slowness not because complexity is fragile, but because complexity is honest about its costs. Complexity cannot cheat time. It cannot skip integration. It cannot bypass memory formation. Slowness is the price complexity pays to remain itself while changing. This is why systems that respect their own tempo can evolve without collapsing. They absorb shocks. They integrate novelty. They retain identity. They do not mistake speed for progress. And this is also why systems that ignore tempo eventually simplify. They lose depth. They lose nuance. They lose memory. They may still function, but they no longer grow in meaningful ways. Slowness is what protects depth. Now let's step back and look at where this leaves us. We've shown that stability is rate limited. We've shown that memory is physical. We've shown that fast systems forget themselves. We've shown that entropy must be paid slowly. We've shown that tempo selects what persists. We've shown that excessive speed leads to collapse. And now we've clarified that slowness is not resistance, but integration. That brings us to the closing reflection of this pillar. If slowness is the condition that allows complexity to survive, then the question we need to ask is not, how fast can we go? The question is, how fast can we go without forgetting who we are? That question applies to atoms, ecosystems, minds, and civilizations alike. And it leads naturally into the final section, where we step back and reflect on what the universe seems to be teaching us through all of this. In the final section, we'll bring these ideas together and ask what it means to live, build, and think in a universe that remembers slowly. Section 8. What the universe is teaching us. At this point, we've moved through several layers of the same idea, each time from a different angle. Rate and stability, memory as a physical property, forgetting under speed, entropy as a cost, tempo as a selection filter, collapse as a consequence of acceleration, slowness as integration rather than resistance. Now it's time to step back and ask a quieter question. What does the universe seem to be teaching us through all of this? Not through philosophy, not through intention, but through the behavior of real systems observed again and again across scales. The first lesson is simple, but easy to ignore. The universe does not reward speed for its own sake. It rewards what persists, and persistence is not about holding still. It is about carrying structure forward through change. That requires time. The universe allows systems to become complex only if they can afford the time required to remember themselves. Systems that respect that requirement accumulate depth. Systems that violate it are filtered out, no matter how clever or powerful they appear. This is not a judgment, it is a constraint. The second lesson is more uncomfortable. Progress that outruns memory is not progress. It is displacement. It moves the system forward in space or state without moving it forward in understanding. When memory fails to form, the system cannot build on its past. It keeps repeating itself in different forms, mistaking novelty for growth. Over time, that repetition becomes exhausting. The system is busy, but it is not advancing. The universe seems indifferent to that busyness. It simply waits. And when the system can no longer sustain the effort, it simplifies. This leads to the third lesson. Complexity is not guaranteed. It is contingent. It depends on conditions that allow slow accumulation of structure. When those conditions disappear, complexity does not degrade gracefully. It collapses abruptly because the memory that held it together was already thinning. This is why the most important work of any complex system is invisible. It is the work of maintenance, the work of repair, the work of learning, the work of remembering. These processes are quiet, they are slow, they rarely attract attention, but they are the only reason complexity survives at all. The fourth lesson is subtle but profound. The universe does not distinguish between natural and artificial systems when applying these constraints. It does not care whether a system is biological, technological, social, or cognitive. The same rules apply. If the system changes faster than it can remember, it will forget. If it forgets, it will lose coordination. If it loses coordination, it will simplify or collapse. This is why attempts to outpace these constraints always fail eventually. You can borrow time, you can compress effort, you can defer costs, but you cannot escape the requirement that memory must be allowed to form. The universe always collects its debt. Now let's bring this home. For humans, this lesson is particularly difficult because we are capable of accelerating our environments faster than our biological, social, and institutional memories evolved to handle. We are very good at creating speed. We are less good at creating stabilization. This does not mean speed is wrong. It means speed must be paired with expanded capacity for repair, learning, and memory. Without that pairing, acceleration becomes destructive. The universe is not telling us to stop changing. It is telling us to change in ways that can be integrated. That is a very different message. It suggests that wisdom is not about foresight alone, but about tempo awareness, knowing when to move quickly and knowing when to slow down long enough for structure to catch up. It suggests that progress is not measured by how fast we move, but by how much we can carry forward without losing ourselves. And it suggests that the future is not decided by who can go fastest, but by who can remember the most deeply. This idea connects directly to everything else in this series: persistence, collapse, renewal, consciousness, witnessing. All of these depend on the same quiet condition: time. Time is not just a dimension we move through. Time is the medium in which memory exists. Without time, nothing can learn. Without learning, nothing can become complex. Without complexity, nothing can witness itself. That realization brings us to the threshold of the next pillar. If memory is the bridge between past and future, then consciousness may be the bridge between information and experience. If slowness allows structure to persist, then awareness may be what allows structure to notice itself. That is where we're going next. Section 9. Where this leaves us. If you've stayed with this pillar from beginning to end, thank you for giving it the time it required. That's not a small thing. The ideas we've explored here don't reveal themselves quickly because they are about the conditions that make remembering possible at all. We've seen that complexity does not come from speed, but from persistence. We've seen that memory is not a metaphor, but a physical property that must be protected against entropy. We've seen that systems forget themselves when change outruns consolidation, and that collapse is often a consequence of tempo mismatch rather than sudden failure. And we've seen that slowness is not resistance to change, but the condition that allows change to become real without erasing what came before. None of this is meant as a warning against progress. It's an invitation to think more carefully about the pace at which we move, build, and transform. The universe does not rush, but it does not stand still either. It changes in a way that allows structure to accumulate, memory to deepen, and complexity to endure. If there is one idea to carry forward from this pillar, it is this: persistence is not about holding on, it is about moving forward without forgetting who you are. My name is Charles Carroll, and this channel is an ongoing exploration of persistence across scales, from the smallest physical structures to the largest systems we're part of. If these ideas resonate with you, I hope you'll continue the journey with me. In the next pillar, we'll step into a question that sits right at the edge of everything we've discussed here. Pillar 7, Consciousness, Across Scales, From Atoms to Minds. We'll explore how information begins to witness itself, how awareness may emerge from structure and memory, and why consciousness might not be an exception to the universe, but a continuation of it. Thank you for taking the time to listen.